Rome conquered the world, but it couldn't feed its own people. Hunger wasn't a mistake, it was policy. In the greatest empire in history, food decided who lived quietly and who became a threat. Chapter 1. An empire built on empty stomachs. By the 1st century CE, Rome stood at the center of the known world. Its empire stretched from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the deserts of North Africa. Conquest poured unimaginable wealth into the city: gold, silver, enslaved labor, and agricultural tribute. Temples rose, aqueducts carried water across valleys, and marble forums projected permanence. Yet beneath this image of abundance lived a contradiction that Roman writers themselves acknowledged but rarely confronted directly. The majority of Rome's population lived on the edge of hunger. The city of Rome may have held close to 1 million inhabitants at its peak. Most were not citizens with land or savings, but laborers, porters, artisans, and the urban poor who depended on daily wages to survive. They owned no farmland, produced no food of their own, and had no capacity to store surplus. A missed day of work meant an empty meal. A missed shipment of grain meant something far worse. Rome's food supply was structurally fragile. The city produced almost none of what it consumed. It relied on constant imports of grain, moving across sea routes vulnerable to storms, piracy, administrative failure, and political disruption. This dependence created a permanent state of anxiety among the lower classes. Ancient sources, such as Juvenal and Tacitus, reference food shortages not as rare disasters, but as recurring pressures embedded in urban life. Hunger, in Rome, was not evenly distributed. Senators and equestrians controlled land, rents, and grain contracts. Large estates, latifundia, dominated Italy, worked by enslaved labor, while free poor citizens crowded into the capital. Seeking survival, the system rewarded concentration and punished independence. For the poor, hunger was not simply a lack of food, it was a condition of powerlessness. This imbalance was not accidental. Roman political stability depended on managing, not eliminating, mass poverty. Hunger kept the population focused on immediate survival rather than long-term resistance. It narrowed political demands to a single question: when will the grain arrive? In this way, Rome's unmatched wealth coexisted with chronic deprivation. The empire fed itself by keeping millions perpetually close to starvation, an empire built, quite literally, on empty stomachs. Chapter 2. Grain as Power, the fragile lifeline of Rome. Rome's survival depended on a supply chain unlike anything the ancient world had ever sustained. The city itself produced almost no food. Its population was far too large, its surrounding countryside insufficient. Instead, Rome lived on imported grain, an artificial lifeline stretched across the Mediterranean. Control of that lifeline meant control of the city. By the late Republic and early Empire, the primary grain suppliers were Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and, most critically, Egypt. After Augustus annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, its Nile-fed harvests became indispensable. Ancient sources estimate that Egypt alone may have supplied up to 1/3 of Rome's grain. This was not a matter of convenience, it was necessity. Without Egyptian grain, Rome could not function. The system that managed this flow was known as the annona. It was a vast administrative and logistical operation involving provincial governors, tax collection in kind, merchant contracts, state warehouses, river transport along the Tiber, and massive harbor facilities at Ostia and later Portus. On paper, it was an achievement of imperial organization. In reality, it was perpetually vulnerable. Grain shipments depended on favorable winds and safe seas. Storms could delay fleets for weeks. Shipwrecks were common. Piracy, though reduced under imperial rule, never disappeared. Administrative corruption and mismanagement further weakened the system. A single disruption, late sailing season, failed harvest, or political crisis, could send shockwaves through the city. For Rome's poor, this fragility translated directly into fear. Food prices could spike overnight. Bread could vanish from markets. Riots recorded by historians such Cassius Dio and Tacitus often began not with ideology, but with hunger. The crowd's anger was predictable because the risk was constant. This dependence also reshaped power. Emperors understood that grain was not merely sustenance, it was authority. Augustus placed Egypt under his personal control, barring senators from entering without permission. The message was clear. Whoever controlled the grain controlled Rome. Food insecurity made the urban population politically exposed. Their survival hinged on forces far beyond their influence: weather, shipping schedules, imperial favor. In this system, hunger was not an emergency to be solved, but a vulnerability to be managed. The annona did not eliminate hunger, it regulated it, and in doing so, it transformed grain into the most effective instrument of power in the Roman world. Chapter 3: Bread for Silence. The politics of free grain by the late Republic. Roman leaders had learned a dangerous lesson: hunger could mobilize the masses. The response was not to eliminate poverty, but to manage it. Out of this calculation emerged the grain dole, later formalized under the empire as the cura annonae. Publicly, it appeared as generosity. In practice, it was a system of conditional survival. The origins of free grain distribution trace back to 123 BCE, when Gaius Gracchus introduced subsidized grain sales to Roman citizens. What began as reform soon became expectation. By the 1st century BCE, hundreds of thousands of citizens in Rome relied on state grain to survive. Augustus later reorganized the system, placing it under imperial authority and fixing the number of recipients at around 200,000 adult male citizens. This number mattered, not for inclusion, but exclusion. Women, children, enslaved people, foreigners, and many of the poorest residents were not eligible. Access required citizenship, registration, and compliance with administrative rules. Survival was bureaucratic: miss a registration, lose status, fall out of favor. The grain stopped. The grain dole was not designed to nourish fully. It provided wheat, not prepared food, and only enough to prevent starvation. Recipients still needed fuel, mills, ovens, and time to turn grain into bread. Hunger remained constant, just controlled. The system kept the poor alive, but never secure. Politically, the effect was profound. Dependence replaced leverage. The crowd no longer demanded structural change, it demanded continuity. The question was not justice or redistribution, but whether the grain ships had arrived. Emperors understood this dynamic clearly. Claudius personally intervened during grain shortages, even guaranteeing merchants against losses. Not out of compassion alone, but because unrest threatened imperial legitimacy. Public order became inseparable from food distribution. Grain was handed out at designated locations, on fixed schedules, under supervision. Large crowds gathered, monitored, and counted. The state did not merely feed bodies, it tracked them. Ancient critics noticed the cost. Juvenal famously reduced Roman political life to panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The phrase endures because it captured a reality Romans recognized: food had replaced participation. The grain dole silenced hunger just enough to mute resistance. It did not empower the poor. It bound them to the state, to routine, and to obedience. Hunger remained, but now it served a purpose. Chapter 4: Hunger as Crowd Control. Rome's rulers did not fear invasion as much as they feared the crowd. The greatest threat to stability came not from foreign enemies, but from the dense, restless population packed into the capital. Hunger turned that population volatile. Controlled hunger made it manageable. Urban unrest was a recurring feature of Roman life. Food shortages triggered some of the city's most dangerous moments. Cassius Dio records repeated incidents where crowds gathered in the Forum, or at the Circus Maximus, not to debate policy, but to demand grain. These assemblies were unpredictable, emotionally charged, and capable of turning violent with little warning. Emperors understood that starvation produced desperation, and desperation could produce revolt. The solution was not abundance, but calibration. Hunger kept the population tired, divided, and focused on survival. A person worried about tomorrow's meal had little energy for sustained resistance. The poor competed with one another for access to food, work, and favor, preventing unified action. In this environment, collective political organization rarely lasted. When unrest did erupt, imperial responses followed a pattern. Temporary relief would be announced, emergency distributions, price controls, or public assurances. These measures were often enough to dissolve crowds without altering the underlying system. Once calm returned, reforms stopped. The threat had passed. Several emperors faced the consequences of mismanaging this balance. Under Tiberius, grain shortages led to public anger that even his authority struggled to contain. Caligula's neglect of grain logistics, combined with financial mismanagement, worsened shortages and public hostility. Claudius, by contrast, invested heavily in harbor infrastructure at Ostia and Portus, not to eliminate hunger, but to reduce the frequency of crises that could spiral out of control. Food policy became a form of policing. The crowd did not need constant violence to be subdued. Hunger did the work quietly. It shortened tempers but also shortened horizons. The state's objective was not to nourish its people well, but to prevent them from becoming dangerous. Roman authors were explicit about this fear. The crowd, when hungry, was described as irrational, childlike, and threatening, language that justified control rather than reform. Hunger was framed as a natural condition of the poor, not a political failure. In Rome, public order rested on an unspoken calculation. Keep the population alive, but never comfortable. Hunger was not a problem to be solved. It was a tool, one that kept the empire stable by keeping its poorest citizens permanently on edge. Chapter 5: Spectacle instead of security. When food was scarce, Rome did not reduce inequality. It increased distraction. The empire invested enormous resources in spectacle, gladiatorial games, chariot races, religious festivals, and public shows, often at the same moments when structural hunger remained unresolved. This was not contradiction. It was strategy. Public entertainment in Rome was not optional. It was political infrastructure. Emperors were expected to provide games, and failure to do so was read as weakness or indifference. These events drew tens of thousands into controlled spaces, focused attention away from daily hardship, and transformed frustration into emotional release. The poor, temporarily fed with excitement if not bread, were absorbed into ritualized consumption of violence and celebration. The scale was immense. The Colosseum, completed under Vespasian and Titus in the late 1st century CE, could hold over 50,000 spectators. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew even larger crowds. These spectacles required enormous funding, money that could have expanded food storage, stabilized prices, or improved distribution. Instead, it was spent where it produced immediate political returns. Ancient observers understood the trade-off. Juvenal's phrase panem et circenses captured a widely recognized reality: entertainment substituted for civic engagement. The crowd no longer expected participation in governance, it expected regular diversion. Hunger made this exchange possible. A population living in precarity was more responsive to immediate pleasures than long-term reform. Spectacle also structured time. Festivals and games punctuated the calendar, creating predictable moments of relief from monotony and anxiety. They reminded the poor that the state could still provide something, even if it was not security. The emotional intensity of the games temporarily dissolved social tension, turning collective anger into collective attention. Crucially, spectacle worked best when paired with minimal sustenance. The grain dole ensured survival, entertainment ensured compliance. Together, they formed a system of control that required neither constant repression nor constant generosity. This balance did not eliminate resentment, but it redirected it. Instead of organizing around shared deprivation, the poor organized around teams, champions, and spectacles. Political energy was dispersed into rivalry and fandom. Hunger remained in the background, unresolved but momentarily forgotten. Rome's rulers did not misunderstand the needs of the poor. They understood them precisely. Security creates independence. Distraction creates dependence. In choosing spectacle over reform, the empire revealed its priorities, and why hunger was allowed to persist. Chapter 6: The Geography of Hunger, where the poor lived. Hunger in Rome was not only a matter of supply, it was shaped by space. The physical layout of the city reinforced deprivation, concentrating risk and scarcity, where the poor lived and insulating the wealthy from its consequences. Most of Rome's lower classes were crowded into insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that dominated the urban landscape. These structures were often poorly constructed, vulnerable to fire and collapse, and packed tightly along narrow streets. Ancient writers like Strabo and Juvenal described neighborhoods where buildings leaned over another, light barely reached the ground, and safety was minimal. For the poor, housing was temporary, unstable, and inseparable from daily survival. Food access within this environment was limited. Insulae had no kitchens designed for large-scale cooking and no capacity for food storage. Grain received from the state still had to be milled and baked, often requiring payment to private mills or communal ovens. Bread was purchased daily, not stockpiled. When prices rose or supply faltered, hunger followed immediately. Distance mattered. The poorest districts lay far from central markets and distribution points. Carrying grain or bread across the city required time and physical effort, resources the working poor could not spare easily. A missed distribution or closed market could mean an empty day. Fire risk added another layer of insecurity. Because open flames were dangerous, cooking was restricted in many buildings. Entire neighborhoods could burn, destroying what little food and property residents possessed. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, thousands were displaced, worsening hunger and dependency. Imperial rebuilding focused on order and spectacle, not food resilience. In contrast, elite Romans lived in domus with private kitchens, storage rooms, and enslaved labor. Their access to food was buffered by wealth, landholdings, and patronage networks. Hunger rarely crossed these boundaries. The city itself became a map of inequality. Physical proximity did not mean shared experience. The poor lived densely, precariously, and without margin for disruption. Urban design ensured that hunger was immediate and personal, never abstract. This geography was not accidental. Concentrated poverty made surveillance easier and unrest more predictable. Hunger stayed localized, contained within neighborhoods already marked as marginal. Rome did not simply govern through policy. It governed through space, and hunger followed the lines drawn by stone, rent, and power. Chapter 7: Charity Without Power. Why help never changed the system? Rome did not lack charity. What it lacked was redistribution. Assistance to the poor existed, but it was carefully structured to preserve hierarchy rather than challenge it. Help flowed downward as favor, not as right, and that distinction mattered. Elite Romans were expected to display generosity. Wealthy patrons funded food distributions, banquets, building projects, and occasional relief during shortages. These acts were public, performative, and deeply political. Inscriptions recorded benefactions, statues honored donors. Charity enhanced reputation and reinforced social rank. It did not alter the conditions that made charity necessary. At the center of this system was the patron-client relationship. Poor citizens attached themselves to powerful men in exchange for small gifts, meals, or legal support. This dependence was personal and unequal. A client gained short-term survival, not security. A patron gained loyalty, visibility, and influence. Hunger kept this relationship intact. A population with independent access to food would not need patrons. Imperial charity followed the same logic. Occasional cash distributions, congiaria, public feasts, or emergency grain handouts were announced during crises or celebrations. They calmed unrest and generated gratitude, but they were temporary by design. Long-term solutions, land reform, wage protection, or expanded eligibility for food support, were largely avoided. Such measures risked reducing dependence. Ancient moralists often framed poverty as a personal failing or a natural condition. This rhetoric justified limited aid while absolving the system itself. The poor were to be managed, guided, and assisted, but never empowered. Even when emperors intervened directly, the goal was stability, not equity. Relief ended when calm returned. Hunger resumed its role as pressure. In this way, Roman charity functioned as containment. It softened the sharpest edges of deprivation without dismantling the structure that produced it. The poor survived, but always on someone else's terms. Hunger remained, because hunger preserved the balance of power. Chapter 8, When Hunger Turned Dangerous. Despite Rome's careful management of scarcity, hunger could never be fully controlled. When the system failed, even briefly, the consequences were immediate and dangerous. Food shortages stripped away the routines and distractions that kept order intact, exposing how thin the line between stability and chaos truly was. Ancient historians repeatedly describe moments when hunger pushed the population beyond endurance. In 19 CE, during the reign of Tiberius, disruptions in the grain supply led to panic and public fury. Tacitus records that crowds openly blamed imperial administrators, forcing the emperor to intervene personally. The crisis was diffused not by reform, but by emergency measures and stern warnings. Order returned, but nothing fundamental changed. Under Caligula, neglect of grain logistics combined with financial excess worsened shortages. Suetonius notes public hostility driven by hunger, compounded by the emperor's erratic behavior. The crowd's anger was no longer abstract, it was directed at the ruler himself. Hunger stripped away imperial mystique, revealing vulnerability at the top. Food riots followed a recognizable pattern. Crowds gathered at distribution points, harbors, or political centers. Demands were simple and urgent: grain, price controls, access. When relief was delayed, anger escalated. Property was damaged, officials were threatened. The danger was not ideological revolution, but uncontrolled mass desperation, something Roman elites feared deeply. Assassinations and political violence were often linked to these pressures. While emperors were not overthrown by famine alone, hunger intensified existing tensions and delegitimized authority. An emperor who could not feed Rome could not rule Rome. Claudius responded more effectively than many predecessors, investing in new harbors at Ostia and Portus. To stabilize supply, his actions reveal the lesson Roman rulers learned repeatedly. Hunger had to be contained before it turned political. Infrastructure was expanded not to end deprivation, but to prevent explosion. These crises exposed the truth beneath Rome's food system. Hunger was useful only while predictable. Once it slipped beyond control, it threatened the very order it was meant to preserve. The empire survived not because it eliminated hunger, but because it learned, again and again, how close it always stood to collapse from below. Chapter 9, The Quiet Truth. Hunger outlived the empire. Rome eventually fell, but its hunger system did not disappear with it. The mechanisms that governed food, dependency, and power proved more durable than emperors, legions, or marble monuments. Long after the Western Empire fragmented in the 5th century, the logic endured. Those who control food control people. Roman hunger was not the result of ignorance or incapacity. It was the outcome of deliberate choices about land, labor, and distribution. Wealth was concentrated, production was separated from consumption. Survival was made conditional. These structures outlived Rome because they were effective. Later societies inherited the same patterns. Medieval cities relied on imported grain and faced similar cycles of scarcity and unrest. Early modern states regulated bread prices and punished hoarding. Not to end hunger, but to prevent revolt. The lesson Rome demonstrated, that food insecurity could discipline populations without constant force, remained quietly influential. What makes Rome unsettling is not its cruelty, but its clarity. The empire understood that full security creates independence. Independence creates demands. Hunger narrows those demands to survival. When people are focused on eating tomorrow, they rarely organize for structural change. Ancient sources never describe a Rome without hunger. Even at its height, deprivation remained normal for the majority. The empire solved logistics, built roads, commanded seas, but never abolished scarcity for its own people. That absence speaks louder than any reform. Rome's story forces an uncomfortable reflection. Hunger is often presented as failure, of harvests, markets, or leadership. Rome shows another possibility: hunger as policy. Not starvation, but controlled deprivation. Enough to live, never enough to be free. This is why Rome controlled the poor through hunger, and why the strategy survived. The empire itself. If you want to understand how power really works, not just in Rome, but across all of history, this channel is for you. We don't tell heroic myths. We study real systems, real control, and real consequences. Subscribe to Silent Scholars for deep, documentary-style history, because the past explains more about the present than we like to admit.